Thank you very much, Acting Speaker. And I too rise to speak on the Domestic Building Contracts Amendment Bill 2025. And let me reassure the member for Albert Park from the outset that the Liberal Nationals coalition will not be opposing the bill before the chamber today. But that is not to say that we do not have serious concerns about how we have ended up at the point we are in today and the way the government has dragged its feet to bring the reforms before us that it contained in this bill being debated in the parliament today. Acting Speakers, I note that the bill follows the government's review of the domestic building industry after what was a catastrophic collapse of Porter Davis Homes in early 2023. And back at the time that we saw the collapse of Porter Davis Homes, I was the Shadow Minister for Home Ownership and Housing Affordability and had much of the carriage of the issue at the time. And, Acting Speaker, that meant that I spoke to many home builders in this state who had lost their deposits, who had lost their hope of being able to build their dream home as a result of the collapse of Porter Davis. But we know it wasn't just Porter Davis that collapsed in Victoria. We've seen a series of home builders collapse, whether it was Hallbury Homes and a range of other family-sized home builders, that their collapse has meant thousands of aspirational Victorian families who have saved incredibly hard to save their deposit for their dream of owning a little piece of this great state, meaning that they could not achieve that and they were left in the lurch and they were left thinking, how on earth will I ever be able to own my own home? How will I ever be able to get back to the point of being able to build my own home because of the collapse of these home builders? Now, I note the Minister stated in his second reading speech that this bill, and I quote, will better protect Victorians building or renovating their homes. But unfortunately, like so much Labor legislation, this bill is simply too late and too many Victorian families have paid the price of the incompetence of the Allan Labor government when it comes to managing the housing market in this state. Now, I heard a member on the other side talk before about the fact that the government claims to be all about home ownership in this state. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We saw the former Premier stand up and say that he doesn't think that Victorians want to own their own home anymore. They're happy to be renters. Young Victorians, they don't have that aspiration to own their own little piece of Victoria, to have their own home and to create that important part of security for their family and for their long-term wealth in this state. They're happy to rent. And then, of course, we saw the housing statement announced by the government. Now, this is a very glossy document that at the time the government said would result in 800,000 homes being built over the decade, or 80,000 homes each and every year. Now, the government has crab-walked back from that target because they are failing abysmally to actually come anywhere near it, that annual target of 80,000 homes. And you'd have to wonder why that is the case in this state when you see the fact that we've got building costs soaring as a consequence of many of the issues raised in this bill. We are seeing taxes imposed on the property sector day in, day out by this government. And, of course, we have a situation where this government doesn't believe in home ownership. In that housing statement, a glossy document, home ownership is mentioned once. It is mentioned once, Acting Speaker. So this is a government that likes to talk the talk, bring housing legislation before this parliament week in, week out, yet does nothing to actually increase housing supply in this state, does nothing to drive down the cost of a new home for an aspirational Victorian, does nothing to actually make it easier for a young person to get into their own home. And at the same time, they are taxing the property industry out of this state. They are simply picking up and leaving. They do not want to be here. They do not want to develop here in Victoria because they cannot afford to do it, with the taxes that are absolutely crushing the property sector here in Victoria. Acting Speaker, the bill before us today came about, as I said, as a result of the collapse of Porter Davis going into liquidation. Now, that left 1,700 homes unfinished and almost 800 customers stranded who had already signed a contract and paid a deposit. Another 779 customers who had signed a contract and paid a deposit were also affected, while 410 employees were also made redundant. But what we do know, Acting Speaker, is that while those opposite like to say that they are on the side of the consumer, well, back in 2022, the former Housing Minister, the member for Essendon, actually received a briefing from his department on July 11, 2022, advising him on potential insolvencies in the residential construction sector and options to de-risk consumers. This was a brief that went to the government, that went to the minister months before the Porter Davis collapse, months before, warning the government about the pressures on the domestic building industry and the risk of insolvencies and presenting options to de-risk consumers. Now, we know that none of those options were picked up at the time. So it's all very well and good for members to come in here today and say the legislation before us is fantastic, it's going to make such a difference. Well, where was it 3 years ago, Speaker? Where was that legislation when the minister was presented with a brief saying that this was going to happen, that this was a real risk to consumers in this state? And it's not just Porter Davis that collapsed, it's a raft of home builders that have seen thousands of families stranded in this state. And as I said earlier, I got to know many of these families, and particularly those who saw their dreams of home ownership, of building their own home, collapse when Horbury Homes went into liquidation. People like Cameron Compton, who had paid $40,000 deposit for his dream home, was continuing to pay that mortgage and had no sense of how he was going to continue to build that home and provide a home for his family. And people like Sushant and Anamika Shakranki, who paid $78,000 for their deposit to build their dream home in Officer. Yet when these builders collapsed, the government refused to support them. The government had said to those families, to those who had paid deposits under the Porter Davis company, that we will come in and provide some support. But for any other home builders who collapse subsequent to that, we're not going to offer that same level of support. Now, Speaker, it makes no sense that those people who suffered the exact same consequences when their home builder collapsed did not receive the same support from the government as those Porter Davis customers. Yet the Horbury Homes customers had to beg the government. They had to beg the government to allow them to come into this compensation scheme. And I'm proud to say that eventually, through their advocacy and our pressure, we forced the government's hand and they provided them with that support and that compensation. But it comes back to the point, why didn't the government take action when it was warned in 2022 that the system and the sector was under immense pressure? And Speaker, let's be very clear why the sector was under immense pressure. It is because of the inflationary impact of the mismanaged big build in this state. Nearly $50 billion of blowouts on major government projects flows through to the private sector. It means the cost of supplies goes up. It means the cost of labour goes up, and that flows through to the domestic building industry. And so while we saw Porter Davis, Horbury Homes, these builders not doing the right thing when it comes to taking out DBI insurance, it was also partly the fact that costs skyrocketed and they couldn't keep up. But it also comes back to the fact that the VBA at the time was not doing its job. It was a requirement back then that every builder take out domestic building insurance. Every builder take that out when a deposit was signed. And the VBA knew that this was not occurring. Yet they were a toothless regulator, failing to do its job. Failing to do its job. Acting Speaker, we have a situation where thousands of Victorians have been left high and dry as a result of the collapse of these home builders. It never should have happened. The minister was warned months in advance and presented with options, failed to take action, and that's the consequences of mismanagement in this state.
Ashwood.